you have to be willing to be bad at something. You have to be willing to not understand, how does this work, and why does this work, and why are they doing it this way? If that general curiosity leads to discovery, leads to you learning more about that topic, that issue, that capability.
Hello and welcome to the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell & Associates. Nestell & Associates is an ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Donald, the founder of Invert Ventures, a change strategy firm, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jack Nestell, the founder of Nestell & Associates and the host of the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast. Jack?
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm always so excited and looking forward to fun conversations with you and our guest. Our next guest, Nour, helps visionary leaders rethink and reinvent key parts of their business for future growth. Nour and his team advises global clients on the fundamental mindset shift required to instill innovation beyond their current skill sets and organization structure that includes courage, commitment, and construct. This is going to be a great conversation. Joining us from Atlanta, Georgia, Nour, welcome to the show, and it's an honor to have you.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Looking forward to this. So, Nour, I guess my first question is, please tell us more. Introduce yourself a little further to our listeners, if you would, please.
Sure. So this is, I feel incredibly blessed. This is year 19 of my practice. I predominantly focus on really helping global organizations integrate strategic relationships in really every facet of their business. I believe it can accelerate not just strategy formulation, but execution, innovation, obviously, hopefully profitable growth. And I've been blessed. This is Curve Vendors, I think what I talk about today is book number 11. Pre-pandemic, I would speak 50, 60 times a year, most often on my book topics, and really develop both the passion and, I like to think, deep domain expertise around relationship dynamics. If you think of customers, if you think of member-based organizations like associations, partners, distributors, but also internal relationships, which often go neglected, employees, contractors, investors, board members. And what we've proven over the years is it's more than a soft skill. We all know it's a lot more difficult than most people realize or imagine. It can be quantifiable. It should be more intentional. And if it's strategic, it tends to create exceptional experiences. It tends to elevate both individual leader, but their organizational brands, strengthens their culture. Much more importantly, really drives this idea of a consistent growth. I don't know any organization that can cut its way to growth. So we tend to focus a lot of our relationship advisory work around driving profitable growth. Personally, as you mentioned, I live in Atlanta, 2 teenagers, 19-year-old who's a second year at Georgia Tech, a daughter, and a 17-year-old son who's a senior in high school. I'm an adjunct faculty at Emory University, my alma mater that goes right up business school. I went to grad school. And on a personal note, I'm originally from Iran. I immigrated in the U.S. 1981 with $100, a suitcase, didn't know anybody, and didn't speak a word of English. So in many ways, my life is a poster for what I try to teach organizations to think about and implement more often.
Great. Thank you, Nour. I know you've had some great experiences and successes, and I'm really looking forward to sharing that in your insight with our listeners. So thank you so much for that. I know, Nour, one of your areas of expertise is what you call relationship economics, which is actually a trademarked idea, I believe, on your website. Can you share with our listeners what you mean by that?
Sure. So I think it's important to give the listeners a little bit of a background. So I wrote about it in my book as well, and I certainly didn't get it then, but I certainly understand now that my dad walking me through bazaars of Iran, I think it was 5 or 6 years old, it wasn't just to get what mom needed to, make as meals or what he needed around the house. Dad also had a relationship list. And whether it was access to a plumber or an influential politician, he wanted to make sure we intentionally visited with relationships that were important to him. And fast forward several decades, and what I saw early on in really advising these large organizations, whenever they faced a challenge or an opportunity, they would often think about what should we do and how should we do it, but sell them who do we need? Sell them who do we know, and how do we connect the dots with a unique value? So as I said, beyond intellectually understanding that relationships are important, I've spent 2 decades really demonstrating their quantifiable value, really demonstrating their strategic value, really demonstrating that it's more than just this soft, fuzzy, soft skill. It really is often an individual, a team, and an organization's biggest undervalued asset. So when you combine this soft, nebulous thing we all call relationships with things like relationship heat maps and, relationship ecosystems and this relationship currency kind of process we've developed. So a lot of intellectual property around, as I said, being intentional, being strategic, and being quantifiable about relationships. That's where relationship economics comes from.
That's just a very fascinating and interesting idea, Nour, and I will certainly be talking about that a little bit more later on in the interview. And certainly I know that's something that you touch on in your book as well. And for our listeners, again, Nour's book is Curve Benders, and we'll have the link for his book in our show notes as well. But Nour, you state on your site, nourgroup.com, that, quote, "It has never been easier to blame external factors for problems of our own making. Real innovation is the key to survival of your company. Are you willing to accept the uncertainty, risk, and disruption it can cause in your status quo? What will it take for you to think and lead differently?" End quote. So, Nour, if innovation leadership can be so uncertain, risky, and disruptive, why change the status quo to begin with, especially if you're in a state of stability and, somewhat successful?
No question. I appreciate you bringing up Curve Benders. Again, this is book number 11. And, this global pandemic, I think, has demonstrated how woefully underprepared we were. And most of your audiences realize that this thing is not, that probably have heard the expression black swan event, because we kind of know what these things are. We knew what a pandemic was. We'd seen them before. We just have no idea when they're going to happen or how deep will be their impact. And if you think about it, for most knowledge workers, can you imagine if we didn't have internet access the last, 15, 18 months? I think we'd be in even deeper trouble than we are now.
Yeah.
So yet the biggest concern most leaders I speak with have right now is around cybersecurity. And imagine a cyber attack, more than just a ransomware against a particular company, but what if it was, a big swath of our grid? And, now if we don't have electricity, if we don't have power, if we don't have, internet access, it's going to be very difficult for us to do half the stuff we're doing. So I cringe when I hear leaders talk about annual strategic planning, because strategy is not a calendar-driven anything, number one. And this pandemic is an impetus for leaders to really think and lead differently. And what I struggle with is, again, I'm sure you've heard it, I'm sure your audience have heard it, every excuse in the book suddenly falls in the COVID bucket, right? We can't deliver that service because of COVID. We can't ship this. We don't have enough people because of COVID. Some of it I get. I understand. This global pandemic disrupted a lot of business models. But if you peel back the onion, it was poor leadership. It was poor planning. It was poor culture. It was, things that we neglected for so. And I have clients who have neglected their IT infrastructure for decades. And suddenly they have to send 2,000 people, 2,500 people to go work from home, and they realize that 1,800 of them are all using still desktop computers. And the CIO has been clamoring for, we need to upgrade our technology infrastructure for 6 years. He got about $10 million approved in 6 days because they realized that they would not be relevant if they didn't do that. So status quo works perfectly well in a known and a highly predictable business model, in a known and a fairly risk-averse leadership structure. Tell me what part of our world is highly known. Tell me what part of our world is highly predictable. So if the market is that dynamic, will the same way you've been doing things for the last decade or two really suffice in face of those constantly changing challenges and opportunities?
Great insight. So, Nour, you mentioned in your new book, and again, that's Curve Benders, you share how strategic relationships can power your nonlinear growth in the future of work. So this is putting into play the idea of what we discussed in the first question of relationship economics. Can you elaborate more on what you mean by nonlinear growth?
Sure. So if you think about, for most of us, again, as knowledge workers, as business professionals, to remain relevant, I believe, and my supposition is the only way for any of us to do that is continue to learn and grow. If you think about most learning and growth trajectories that we're all on, they look like a truck ramp, right? 45-degree angle, learn, maybe at some point in the future apply it. And a very good example for all of us is our undergraduate degree. I don't know about you, but it's been a while since I've, looked at differential calculus, right? But we took all those courses, right? We took all those courses because it was some predetermined path, right?
Yeah.
Well, again, in a very dynamic future, for us to remain relevant, that truck ramp, that 45-degree linear curve will no longer suffice. Mm-hmm. And I believe we need to embrace a nonlinear, something that looks more like a hockey stick. And what does that look like? I don't need a 4-year MIT degree. What I want to do is learn how to code. And now, thankfully, with plethora of options, I can learn how to do that in about 30 days. Now, will I be completely proficient? No, but I can learn enough to go apply that learning to solve a problem and then learn something else on top of that and apply the next challenge or opportunity. So now it's no longer learn, maybe at some future apply it. It's quickly learn, more accelerated, more relevant learning, immediately apply it, figure out what worked and what didn't, learn the next step, learn the next opportunity to grow. And I believe that hockey stick is what's going to keep all of us relevant, but it means a very different personal approach, organizational approach to not just learning, but the application of those learnings.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nour. And I think that for me, that's one of my favorite ideas in your book, Curve Benders. Just that idea of learn, apply. It's learn, apply, grow, learn, apply, and so forth. What a great explanation. I really appreciate that idea. And so really to continue on that point, in chapter 2 of your book, you discuss 15 forces impacting your future. Can you maybe share a couple of these? And I would highly recommend for our listeners, again, to grab your book to learn a little bit more about each one of these. And each one of these, I would say, deserves considerable thought and conversation, to be sure. But can you just give us a couple of examples of these 15 forces?
Yeah, happy to do it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when this global pandemic hit, full disclosure, I'm asking, what will the future of my work look like? Again, pre-pandemic, I was on the road 208 days. Pandemic hit, and it dawned on me, I'm not going to get on a plane because there's not going to be any events or conferences or people. Nobody's going to want to see others, visitors in their office buildings and whatnot. So as we started to really research possible disruptions, we found that we identified 15 that I broke into really 4 buckets. So there's a handful that are very personal, and you have immediate and direct control of these. The next group, again, a few of these are really organizational, and they tend to focus on what you need to do with your strategy, what you need to do with your structure, how do you deploy resources to, again, minimize the impact, potential negative impact of these disruptions. The next group are industry. So think of a trade association, think of an ecosystem, think of collaborating with people you haven't had to do that, again, to remain relevant. And then there's a set of transitionary, which is technology and economy fit in that bucket, where they really cross all 3. So that's the high-level structure. And for our audience, if you can imagine a target bullseye-looking concept, that's how we've broken them into that kind of a look. In terms of giving you a couple, again, the premise is none of us have a crystal ball. None of us, if I did, I'd be on the next flight to Vegas. So if we can't really predict when these things are going to happen, how do we get better at planning for them? How do we get better at proactively and intentionally really developing our resilience, really developing our foresight into these? So let me just share a couple. One of them we deeply believe in, which is obviously, and it's very consistent, I think you'd be surprised if I didn't bring it up, your relationship strategy. You have enormous amount of control over the relationships you choose to invest in. What your audience needs to hear, definitive research shows that an average individual can proactively manage about 100 to 150 relationships. So the million-dollar question becomes, which ones? And how do you know? And if you can't invest in everybody equally, how will you then prioritize which relationships you'll invest in? And not just the immediate ones today, but are there relationships that you need to invest in that'll become very relevant in your efforts moving forward, in your growth, in your kind of that journey? I talk about your journey from now to next. So that's one. The other one is, again, I wrote an entire book on this topic, but I thought it would be appropriate to mention it, which is co-creation. What we're finding is, again, in a very dynamic market, none of us have all the answers. So if you don't have all the answers, how do you battle disruptions? How do you make sure that you lead that disruption instead of watch it happen to you? And I deeply believe in this idea of two or more parties coming together to create something, co-create something that neither one could have done by themselves. And they demonstrate, not just talk about it, but demonstrate a vested interest in its long-term success. And I can give you several examples. One of them, easy one, is if you've had any of those Frappuccino, the Starbucks Frappuccino drinks, what most people don't realize, that's actually a co-created solution between Starbucks and Pepsi. Because Starbucks knew coffee, Pepsi knew packaging and distribution and cold and storage and so on and so forth. By the way, it's now a multi-billion-dollar line of business. Here's one where your audience may have not heard of. Adidas, the tennis shoe and athletic company, has co-created tennis shoe that has the German rapid transit, the rail system pass, embedded in the shoe. So think about it a second. The transit company is not in the shoe business, and Adidas doesn't want to run the train system. But if my pass is now embedded in my shoe, and by the way, our footprints are as unique as our fingerprints, so now I can just walk onto that train platform, and I don't have to carry yet another thing with me. Now, extrapolate that forward. What if it was for secured spaces? What if it was for employees that had a reason to be in a certain area, access, versus others that don't? That's an example of co-creation that really creates a new lens that others may not think about.
So, Nour, isn't that where, so you mentioned 2 points here for our listeners, and one is relationship strategy and the other is co-creation. Does relationship strategy precede or need to precede co-creation? Because doesn't thoughtful and being intentional in your relationship strategy will help create more mutually beneficial co-creation?
You're exactly right. I'm a hugger, and in a non-creepy way, if we were together, I would hug you because you're exactly right. The relationship strategy is part of the personal kind of group, and that's absolutely at the dead center of that bullseye logo, if you will. And co-creation is an organizational one, and it's the next tier. And you're right. If you don't identify, build, nurture value-based relationships, co-creation isn't for everybody. It's really for those relationships where you've deepened, they're authentic, they're real, both sides feel like they're better off because they're in that relationship together, and that's where co-creation opportunities come from.
Got it. Yeah, the good relationships create trust and confidence, and so therefore it seems like it would create opportunities or promote opportunities for co-creation.
Absolutely. And again, it isn't just creating the initial co-creation opportunity, it's sustaining it. If you think about most partnerships, the reason they fail is a lack of commitment to the long-term viability of something. So we're all very good at starting things up, right? We're all very good at initiating and getting new ideas off the ground. And everybody goes into it with a great deal of excitement, and then that excitement fades, or the administration changes, or other priorities take over. And we'll get around to it, and starts to grow rust and decay, and suddenly it just kind of falls off. So co-creation, and again, a really good example for your audience would be our kids, right? Most of us can't create kids by ourselves, and they don't stop being your kids at 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, right? You have a long-term vested interest in their success. You want, in essence, the best version of you for them. Imagine if that was a product or a service or a new market opportunity.
Great analogy. I like that analogy. So, Nour, in Chapter 3, I just want to share another one with our listeners, and this was just an idea that I thought was very interesting. And that is, in Chapter 3, you discussed this idea of accelerated relevancy. Can you share more with our listeners on what that means exactly?
So again, I love stories, and my mom and dad still live in Iran. Dad doesn't want anything to do with technology, right? The only reason mom figured out Facebook and Skype was so she could keep up with the grandkids. But dad is just not interested. And it's just hard to imagine. By the same token, he was born in the 1930s, and so in some ways he's no longer relevant with all that we do with technology, right? So if you think about this idea of relevance, it's never a point in time. You can't be relevant today and not relevant tomorrow, or vice versa, right? So it has to be a continuation. It has to be an ongoing effort. And what I talk a lot about is truly transformational leaders. Engage others, connect in a way that increases that motivation, that really morality, that being receptive to understanding the needs and what moves people, right? And what happens is they help others reach their greatest potential. So relevance, number one, has to be self-initiated. It's got to be intrinsic. It's got to be something you deeply believe in, is that I'm going to make sure I stay relevant. So again, I want to make this practical for your listeners. I download a mobile app a week, at least one a week. And I got to tell you, some of them, complete waste of time and money and effort. Others have become invaluable in what I do and how I do it. But unless I go figure out, unless I invest in those, and by the way, you have to be willing to be bad at something. You have to be willing to not understand, how does this work and why does this work and why are they doing it this way? If that general curiosity leads to discovery, leads to you learning more about that topic, that issue, that capability. So one, it has to be intrinsic. The other one is a leadership opportunity. So I cannot lead a significant transformation by myself. So if I tap into others, if I tap into relationships most relevant to that transformation, I can now begin to, surprisingly, bend the curve on that trajectory that we're headed for. And I believe that's the formula to remaining relevant over some period of time.
Powerful notion. That's just really fascinating idea. Nour, you just stated in your response this idea of transformational leadership. And one of my favorite leadership books is actually called Leadership, Theory and Practice by Peter Norhaus. And in that, he describes transformational leadership as the consistent act of engaging with others and connecting in a way that increases motivation and being receptive to the needs and motives of others and helping followers reach their greatest potential. And I know that in your book as well, I believe it was chapter 6, you describe what seems to me to be a significant transformational leadership attribute, and that is curve bending in the lives of others. And I thought that was a pretty powerful idea, once again. But I know it's a big topic, but in general, how do you do that in a way that's effective?
So first and foremost, I've always been a huge believer that you cannot help people who don't want to help themselves. There's what I've identified over the years is really three types of business colleagues we all work with. There's climbers, right? People who are continuously learning and growing, and they don't just talk about lifelong learning. They actually live it. Maintainers. I've got a bowling league on Wednesday nights. Don't mess with my bowling league because that's really important to me, right? No, thank you. I'm not interested in learning anything new. I want to maintain. And then there's decliners and retirees. And this has nothing to do with age. It's a mindset that I'm just going to coast here and I'll be just fine. So candidly, I have no interest in the maintainers or retirees. God bless them. Probably really good people. But they're not growth-oriented. And by that, I mean their mindset isn't growth-oriented. Their mindset isn't digital. Their mindset isn't entrepreneurial. And those are three foundational mindsets. The way you think drives those opportunities to really drive your personal and professional growth. And it drives the leader's opportunity to leverage that mindset, leverage that curiosity, leverage that insatiable appetite to learn and grow and evolve as an individual, as a manager, as a leader, to really put those fewer individuals in charge of leading, testing, experimenting new ideas that will change the trajectory of the organization. So transformational leaders, the ones I work with, one of the first things we do is pick a SEAL Team 6. You don't need a battalion to transform. You need a small group that is very focused, that can go get those early successes, go get those early wins. When you do that, you'll start to gain momentum. You start to bend, shape, guide the ecosystem in the direction you want it to go. That's how you get attention. That's how you get support. That's how you start to change that trajectory very differently than what it was headed for.
So, Nour, you just mentioned the idea in your response here of experimenting and the value of experimenting. And I actually wanted to pick your brain on this idea as well. And I know you discussed this in your book. But, I do know that during ERP organizational change specifically, many stakeholders face great demand and significant risk and challenges. It's not an easy endeavor. It takes significant time, money, and effort. But to realize the greatest effectiveness and efficiencies, these challenges require significant trust and innovation and experimentation and tolerance for risk. And in terms of creating positive change through a culture of experimentation, why is that good? I mean, can't that be quite risky? Aren't there significant risks to experimentation?
Absolutely. So for your audience, and again, you're right, I talk about this extensively in the book in a whole section called Organization of the Future. I want you and your audience to think of kind of two halves to a page. If you think of a landscape piece of paper, on the left-hand side is the core business today. I'm a huge believer of don't mess with the core business. Why? It pays your salary and my fees, okay? And the core business, we've figured out how to do the core business exceptionally well. And the core business is very capable of what I call iteration, which is how do we do the same thing better? But by definition, it's a known business model. It's a proven business model. It's all about steadfast leadership. It's basically a perfect execution box. And if you try to throw a monkey wrench in that perfect execution box, I jokingly call my friends who are chief compliance, chief legal, general counsel, CFOs, I call all of them oncologists because their job is any shiny new thing they see in that perfect execution box, their job is to dig it out and kill it because it threatens the perfect execution box. So what's the answer? The work I do, and I'm certainly not recommending this to everybody because I'll be the first guy to tell you what I'm about to say isn't appropriate or relevant for everybody. But for a few really visionary leaders who realize that the next decade of their business will not be deemed successful if they keep doing what they've been doing for the past decade, we create something we call a sandbox engine. It is physically, it is structurally away from that core business. So it's the right-hand side of the page. And that sandbox engine is all about experimentation. If none of us have a crystal ball and none of us can pick the winners, the only thing you can do on the right-hand side is do what venture capital or private equity firms do, which is still do your due diligence, but let's just say you go and bet on 8 to 10 unique ideas, 8 to 10 unique business models, 8 to 10 really innovative approaches who are actually doing new things, knowing, and here's where that fortitude comes from, knowing that 8 out of 10 may go absolutely nowhere. They're going to be fantastic lessons. Hopefully we'll fail, but we're going to learn something from those failures, and we're going to apply it to the very next opportunity. But 8 out of 10 will go nowhere. The 2 that hit are going to be, in essence, the future of the business. So I'm not advocating risk, certainly blind risk, in the core on the left-hand side. But for a culture of experimentation to really not just survive, but thrive, you have to make prudent bets. And if you bet on business models and you bet on business model innovation, there's an opportunity to disrupt yourself before somebody else does it to you. Does that make sense? Does that resonate?
That makes sense. Definitely resonates. Really, really powerful ideas. So, Nour, I know one of the other areas of expertise, and this is also something you discuss in your book, but how would you define organizational culture, and what role does that play in successful organizational innovation and transformation and even experimentation, as we've discussed here earlier?
Great question. You know, I coach a lot of executives that, and I've been blessed to learn this from some of great leaders I've worked with over the years, that the corner office's primary role is really 2 functions. One is brand. So what's the vision? What's the value? How are you delivering that value in the market? And the second one is the culture, right? Fundamentally, it's got to be a culture that balances performing with learning. So I'm a realist, right? You come in with grandiose visions that you're going to transform this culture somebody somewhere at some point is going to say, okay, so what performance are you delivering? So you have to focus on that performance. But the minute you take your eye off of that culture, learning, growing, be willing to kind of fail and by the way, if you're launching SpaceX or you're doing surgery on my body, please get it perfect. But anything short of those two, right? We ever since we're kids, it's driven into us that failure's bad and failure's unacceptable. Failure's part of learning. And your audience needs to hear this. I ride motorcycles, and falling on a motorcycle is not an if, it's a matter of when. But you wear the gear, so I wear a chest plate, I wear a back plate, I wear an airbag vest that's attached to my motorcycle that if I separate from that bike, the whole thing becomes an airbag. That's just one example of creating an environment where you put yourself in the best possible position to succeed. That's exactly what a leader can do with a culture. So don't tell me you want innovation and transformation if you're not willing to invest in people, the right people, with the right capabilities, not just to deliver the performance you need today, but really make some of those prudent bets we talked about in anticipating and really coming up with real innovation, not innovation theater, and potential disruptions in your future.
Really, Nour, you talk about with your response here and the idea that failure is learning, which is so true. You're really just going back to the first question I asked you, and that's in regards to this idea of nonlinear growth. That's how you grow. And part of that growing.
You're exactly right. And by the way, I've fallen off of my motorcycle 4 times in 10 years. Every time I can tell you what happened, why it happened, what I learned from it, and I haven't made that mistake again. But you're not going to learn those by reading a book or watching a YouTube video. Nothing replaces saddle time. Nothing replaces you learning how to maneuver this vehicle in this case. It replaces you learning how to make a new business model work in your organization than actually trying it.
Nour, one of the ideas that you talk about, and it is why do most innovation initiatives fail? And I thought you had some interesting remarks on that and thoughts. I'm going to challenge you here for our listeners. This is the challenge question.
Sure.
And then let's give our listeners something to reflect about. And then, like I said, we're going to have you back on this program. We have so much to discuss. But in a couple of sentences, why do most innovation initiatives fail?
If you think about our current organizational structures, the metrics and milestones by which we're measured and compensated are not conducive to experimentation. So I have a P&L. I run a profit and loss function. There's a bonus tied to my performance at the end of the quarter. And that bonus is often the profitability of how well I run my business. By definition, investments do not return a short-term result. So if I'm struggling between should I invest in a new initiative, that's going to hurt my bonus. It's going to hurt the way I'm measured. And that core business that I mentioned does not look favorably on me coming up short month after month, quarter after quarter on my P&L performance. So our structures aren't conducive. Our metrics and compensation don't really lend themselves to real innovation. The way we attract and develop talent is typically to help us solve current day challenges and opportunities, not really anticipate future ones. Last but not least, as I said, the organizational structure, the courage to make a long tail investment and really see those transform our business isn't there. And that's why you brought it up. The executives I work with, I tell them, if you bring the courage to think and lead differently, if you bring a commitment to the long-term viability of real innovation, then I can bring the third C, which is a construct. And that's that whole sandbox engine. That's that entrepreneurial structure, even within large enterprises, that we have demonstrated can drive incredible value creation and real innovation in every organization.
Yeah. Back to the idea, you're right, that I mentioned earlier and that you talk about in your book, courage, commitment, and construct. Nour, the whole podcast was really designed and inspired just to share the work of others and learn from others. And so as fellow practitioners, we absolutely benefit from learning from our colleagues and our friends and both boots on the ground practitioners and as well as researchers. But how would you summarize this conversation and your work for our listeners? That is, if you had to distill your work into 3 or 4 sentences, what would you say to ERP organizational change practitioners and organizational stakeholders? What's the biggest tip that you can leave us with today?
Let me give you and your audience 3 to think about. Number 1, I've always been a very strong advocate of don't confuse output with outcome. Mm-hmm. At the risk of never being invited back, an ERP organizational change practitioner is often very focused on output, right? Here's the output I'm creating. Respectfully, no executive, no board I work with cares about the output you create. What they care about is the outcomes from that ERP organizational change implementation, right? Or how you're trying to transform. So focus on the outcomes of your efforts, not just the output, number 1. Number 2, beyond your educational foundation, beyond your professional pedigree, your single biggest and often most underutilized, undervalued asset is your portfolio of relationships. So become more intentional in the relationships you choose to invest in. Number 3, I'm a huge fan of a guy named Marshall Goldsmith, and I love the title of one of his books, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. That which has made you successful to date may or may not be what gets you to the evolution of yourself, your team, your organization. This pandemic, beyond its impact on lives and livelihoods, is a fantastic impetus. It's a fantastic opportunity to think and lead differently. If not you, who? If not now, when? Mm-hmm. You'll let me know when I can do a mic drop, right? At some point, you gotta let me do a mic drop, right? Just like boom, there
mic
you
drop,
go, there you have it.
Well, we couldn't, we were short on words. That was great. Nour, or David, Mr. David Nour, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your work. And for our listeners, please learn more at nourgroup.com. That's NOURGOURP.com. We highly recommend David and his team for anyone serious about effective leadership and transformation. David, thank you again, and be well, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.
Wow, Jack, that was an amazing conversation.
It sure was, Jonathan. So much fun.
Listeners, thank you for joining us on today's episode. We are incredibly excited and grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us on our podcast. We have an incredible lineup of guests, including ERP and organizational change speakers, authors, professors, researchers, pioneers in the field, practitioners, PE partners, business executives, ERP vendors, and organizational stakeholders. We invite you to leave us feedback and a review because we want to make this the most useful and insightful podcast you listen to, and we need your help to do so.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us again this week as we seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community, contribute to the field of ERP organizational change, and bring research and practice closer together. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. Our podcast will draw on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience. Hashtag the ERP Organizational Change Journal.
Bye for now. See you again soon.
Have a fantastic week.